One of the most important aspects of games, especially nowadays, is player feedback. With the rise of social media sites in recent years, with everyone glued to their phones nowadays, every opinion possible is out there. Sometimes these opinions are horrifying, sometimes they are dumb, and sometimes they are needed. But I've never for one second thought that all of these opinions should just be ignored, because if that's the case, well, with gaming, game developers will and can make mistakes that could have been prevented. A good example of this is looking at BioWare, who were developing a looter shooter called Anthem, and reportedly leadership at the company refused to acknowledge, discuss, or even say the name of other looter shooters like Destiny, which have faced their own fair share of issues in the past. If BioWare had actually learned from Destiny's mistakes, Anthem would have been better come release, but it wasn't. Now just imagine that all player feedback is ignored, then games like Anthem would have had some very interesting facial animations, Fallout 76 wouldn't even probably work, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 more than likely would have opened the floodgates to normalizing predatory monetization that's commonly, sadly, in free-to-play and mobile games. Player feedback is essential in so many different ways, but VG247 gaming outlet wrote a piece titled, "Game Developers, It's Time to Stop Listening to the Fans." And I've seen numerous journalists and developers applauding the article, while most gamers obviously, feel a little differently and are a little upset with this piece. This article is not terrible, there's some I can agree with, but it neglects mentioning so much that I find it extremely flawed, and also labeling your audience as entitled is a rather interesting, maybe bold decision by them. But as usual, if you have not already, do consider subscribing for all the latest gaming news, and turn notifications on so you do not miss out on any new content. Nonetheless, I'm going to skip past this opening paragraph because it just basically says that sometimes there's usable feedback that exists, and especially in this live service age, I would say that there's more than an occasional bit of usable feedback. But let's get to the meat of this article, starting off with this. BioWare has a lot to answer for basically. Mass Effect 3 feels like ground zero for toxic fan entitlement. Yes, we're starting off very hot with this take. I'm sure the developer was just trying to do the right thing, but it changed the ending of its game due to negative feedback, bending its creative vision to pander to the baying masses. Something that I honestly never thought a games journalist would say, especially being that games media does a lot of that these days. Now, one interesting thing about Mass Effect 3 is, before the ending, a lot of the marketing, a lot of the statements coming from BioWare was that your choices were going to matter. There was a lot of discussion about the ending of the game, and it all proved to be lies, which BioWare even admitted that they needed to fix it, which is what they did. And it's not like it was just fans that were angry about this. A lot of games journalists even came out with their own articles criticizing the ending of Mass Effect 3. A good example would be Kotaku's coverage. You have this article from Sparky Clarkson in 2013, which says Mass Effect 3's ending disrespects its most invested players. And then I believe this is the editor-in-chief of Kotaku, and he says, "Why I'm glad BioWare might change Mass Effect 3's ending for the fans." The important thing to note about Mass Effect 3 is that the ending was something that a lot of people were let down by because your choices did not matter. I'm not trying to get into spoiler territory, but your choices didn't matter with that original ending, and they went back and fixed it somewhat. And most the audience was happy about that. But obviously VG247, I guess they weren't fans of that decision. Now, with this change in Mass Effect 3's ending, they go on to say this rarely happens in any other medium. Sure, you could point at the Sonic movie changing its appearance over criticism, but it's the video game crowd once again. Honestly, I'd make an argument that Hollywood does change things often. You could look at a lot of television shows with new seasons or new episodes, which will change things that people were not happy about. I mean, if you look to the movies like Terminator's just ignoring a lot of movies that came, like Terminator 3, ignoring that, Terminator Genesis, forget about that, Terminator Salvation, forget about that, and then they're pretty much just saying, yeah, Terminator 1, Terminator 2, the best Terminator movies, let's continue after that with this new film, Terminator Dark Fate. I don't even know how good that's gonna be, but the point is, change does happen quite often, it just happens in a different way. Of course, you don't see episodes being, manually changed, but it does happen. Elsewhere, people have petitioned to have the last season of Game of Thrones remade, but HBO would never do that because it's absurd. To counter that, that, I would bring up the point that Sopranos was extremely controversial years ago, the ending of that. And obviously nothing was changed. But Deadwood, a franchise that only had 2 or 3 seasons, I think it was 3 seasons, and it never got its true ending. For years, people petitioned and asked HBO to finish it, and they did it just about a month ago. And then there's also Star Wars The Clone Wars, an animated series that a lot of people loved, and it never got its ending. And look, Disney did the exact same thing just recently, announcing that they're going to come back with one more season. So it does happen in Hollywood with television shows and movies, and you can make the argument that in music and all kinds of other industries, change does happen, just maybe in different ways. And Jesus, just thinking about it right now, I didn't even bring up the Lost ending or Ghostbusters 2016, which I'm guessing was supposed to be brought into a new franchise, but now they've gone back to the drawing board and are going a different route with Ghostbusters with a new film or whatever. But continuing on, let's get back to this article. Like it or not, the vast majority of video game players just do not understand game development. If a game doesn't run well, it's bad optimization. If there's a lack of features, it is down to development constraints and deadlines, it's lazy developers. Honestly, I never see people saying bad optimization or lazy developers. Usually the criticism is those QA departments probably having some problems, and usually that is leadership or publishers rushing deadlines. And then lazy developers, again, I don't often see people calling out lazy developers. Usually the anger is thrown at leadership of these companies like Activision, Electronic Arts, Bethesda, and so on and so forth. Continuing on, that's not a dig at the gaming audience, it's just that video games are a complex chimera of publisher goals, developer goals, and the realities of working with an ever-shifting vision. And I'm just going to skip ahead because this next few sentences and the next paragraph pretty much just says that video games are complicated and they're very difficult to put together, something I completely agree with. The next VG247 says, you often see video game fans come to the defense of game developers if certain story beats in a game are criticized. Criticism is just that, pointing out that something could be better. It's not asking for something to be changed. Well, that's not completely true, is it? Recently VentureBeat had a whole article about Call of Duty Modern Warfare because it was so disturbing, and their description really didn't sound all that disturbing, especially considering there's a game like Spec Ops: The Line that already exists. But pretty much they said the scenes were so disturbing that it should be censored and the developers should remove them. In my opinion, based on their description of what they said, I don't think so. And if anything, that's just messing with the creative vision. But let's keep on going. This criticism, it's a talking point, a hopefully deeper reading of a game that might help you see it from another angle, yet when a critic points out issues with the handling of certain themes, a portion of the audience cries censorship, then they go off and create petitions to get games changed because games media doesn't do that. Like, if I recall correctly, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, some DLC added sparked up a lot of controversy because it, I guess, forced a certain narrative because there needed to be a pregnancy, and I guess that technically means that it's forcing a relationship. Honestly, I find that a little absurd, and there was only a minority of a bunch of Twitter users screaming out, while the majority of the audience probably didn't care. But again, games media, a lot of articles, a lot of criticism, and that criticism led to, guess what? Change. Part of the issue here is how our industry feeds into this entitlement, whether it's PlayStation saying it's for the players, or it's Xbox head Phil Spencer saying stuff like, games and gamers together now have the sheer magnitude to be a significant unifying force for the world. Whatever that means, our industry goes out of its way to say the customer is always right. What's so crazy about a corporation trying to say that they're thinking about their customers who are actually giving money to them? I don't really understand this criticism, but we're going to keep on going a little bit further down to this article because they criticize some of the opinions on Metal Gear Solid 4, and then they bring up a petition that was sent to President Obama to get DMC pulled from shelves. Honestly, that petition, I bet you 99% of the petition's no longer on the White House website, but it was probably a troll. That's nothing more than what it was. I don't know why we're taking stuff like this seriously. It's like those Reddit posts that have been downvoted to oblivion, and then a journalist writes an article about that downvoted comment to oblivion and tries to paint gamers as just that. It happens often, surprisingly, but I find that absurd. But getting back to BioWare, this is where they bring up Mass Effect Andromeda. It's a game that was taken down by gifts. Development focus was on creating worlds and learning how to use an entirely new engine that is not well suited to RPG development. As such, the facial animation suffered and people took the piss and GIFs. Back in the day, it was given that RPGs didn't look as nice as other games because of the scope. And to that, I would argue that even Mass Effect 3 looked better than Mass Effect Andromeda compared to facial animations, so of course people were going to criticize. And BioWare of course ended up changing that because they were unhappy with people making GIFs and making jokes out of it and mocking the studio. And I understand that some of that did get a little over the line, but maybe at the same time we should be concentrating on the publisher and developer, because there was already a report from Kotaku outlining the disastrous development of Mass Effect Andromeda, a lot of the infighting and a lot of chaos that caused that to happen. But I guess we're just going to concentrate on gamers who mocked it. Find that absurd? A lot of absurdity with this article, people, but let's keep it going. Nowadays, everything looks nice because developers want their games to look good in screens rather than communicate what makes the game special. BioWare's next game, Anthem, looked incredible at the expense of everything else. It appeared to be a direct reaction to that negative feedback, those viral gifs of goofy character expressions. Of course they addressed that, but let's be honest, they didn't really listen to anything other than that. If they were smart, they would have looked at the criticisms of looter shooters, and they didn't do that. They just completely ignored Destiny and various other looter shooters who had trouble in the past, and they just did their own thing, and it ended up biting them in the butt. If they looked at player feedback for those games, the mistakes that Bungie and Blizzard made with their games, I bet you Anthem would have been a better game. Look at any online game community and there's always someone complaining about how their character is not strong enough, or how the character who can counter their hero is too strong. There will be dozens of posts about how their favorite weapon doesn't do enough damage, or how another weapon is OP. There will be another player somewhere typing out the exact opposite. And you know what happens with those posts? Nobody really listens to them. These people are not professional game developers and they just want to make their very narrow experience of a game better for them, not for everyone else. Well, that was not the case with Call of Duty Black Ops 4 recently, was it? Because a lot of people were complaining about a loot box only available DLC weapon that was overpowered, and even the players who obtained it were complaining about it. And that kind of probably hurt their experience because it got buffed. But finally, to the last pieces of this article, and then I'm going to move to some of the responses, which, oh my. My point is, you can never please everyone. There will always be pushback on anything you do, and people only generally say something on the internet if they are pissed off. That's not something I actually agree with. I think a lot of people are just trying to improve things. A good example of that I would bring up is Star Wars Battlefront 2 and the whole loot box debacle over that. People wanted that game to be improved. They also worried about monetization, and Electronic Arts was forced to change because of the amount of outrage that faced them, and that was deserved. They needed to get that, because I could imagine if Star Wars Battlefront 2 went through with that monetization system, it really could have hurt all of gaming, because it seems like a lot of other developers were planning some pretty horrendous monetization systems, but because of the uproar, they backed out. One of those being probably Bethesda's Fallout 76. There's a quote that's often attributed to Henry Ford around the dawn of commercial motor vehicles. If I had asked people what they have wanted, they would have said faster horses. People are generally afraid of change. New ideas always get a bit of pushback. It makes me worry whether this environment of fan feedback development is holding back AAA game development from reaching its true potential. I mean, what it's holding back is publisher greed. If these executives had their way in this AAA gaming industry, they would quickly turn this into the mobile industry, with a lot of clones released and all kinds of monetization BS. That's exactly what they want, and that's why criticism is so important and why player feedback is important. And I get that he wants to circle around that subject, but it has to be included in this discussion if you're going to say that game developers have to stop listening to fans, because I think monetization is one of the most important things, especially in this live service age that we're living in right now. But finally, to the last part of this video, I do want to go over a few of the responses. One specifically coming from PC Gamer, one of their editors, who said that this article was totally spot on. Case in point, today some gamers are mad because they won't be able to kill kids in their Cyberpunk game. It's not feedback, it's entitlement and effing disturbing. Then a Fox journalist would say that, yeah, the Murder Kid mods for Elder Scrolls games prove this is apparently a thing people feel really strongly about. And then PC Gamer's editor hits back saying, yeah, really nasty stuff. People are already saying they'll mod it into Cyberpunk 2077 too, though at least it won't be launching with mod support. First time I've ever considered that a positive. Now, I always find it interesting when a games journalist just makes a bizarre point and there really is no evidence to support this. It's like what I mentioned earlier, where some games media will point out a random downvoted Reddit comment and try to make a point and paint gamers with a certain thing. And I guarantee you those Elder Scrolls mods probably played by 1% of the total amount of owners of Skyrim or whatever Elder Scrolls game. And even then, I think a lot of people just download it because they want to be immersed, total immersion. Personally, not something I support, and I'm okay with the developers not doing it because I think that the reason why they do it is because they want to maintain the innocence of kids, which is kind of something I support. But that's just me. I understand the counterpoint to that, especially since that back in the 90s or early 2000s, there was games like the early Fallout games made it that you could kill kids and there were certain perks you got from it. So it's not like this gaming industry hasn't embraced stuff like that before. So yeah, I don't really see this point where the Cyberpunk 2077 developers should ignore feedback because you're randomly nitpicking at something that you have no evidence to support. I don't see anybody saying that they specifically want to go around killing kids. That's not something. And when there's going to be thousands and thousands of mods, you're going to nitpick that one. That's not something that I can go with because, again, this is nitpicking to make a point. Now, there was one games developer that disagreed with this article. This coming from a Warhorse developer, of course, Kingdom Come Deliverance, a game that a lot of games media not a fan of because of the company's conservative values, a lot of the developers' conservative values. I guess that's a problem in this gaming industry, which is it's very progressive. The vast majority of players just do not understand game development, and judging by the article, journalists understand neither development nor players. It's your responsibility as a dev creator to properly process and react to feedback. That said, pandering is for weaklings. So yeah, I actually do agree with this point. And VG247, the author behind this article, did not take too kindly to this response, and he hit back. But this is where I'm going to kind of leave things. I've already been rambling for a while, and I just wanted to point out this, I'll say it's a hypocrite article. It's like games media does this so often, but now we're just gonna hit toxic entitled gamers. Okay. When you're a gaming publication and a lot of the actual readers of your articles are hardcore gamers, I don't know if that's a stance that you want to take, but you can take it if you want. That's not something I agree with, and the points made in this article they don't reflect what he's trying to say. I can agree with some of the things. I think that there is entitlement that should be stopped. I think that's all across the board, but I guess we don't want to bring up the points of like the Assassin's Creed fiasco, or even bring up the hot coffee situation that happened with politicians wanting that removed, and that had a severe effect all across the board in terms of mature content in games. But yeah, I didn't expect this video to go so long, but I felt like I needed to respond to a lot of the points made in this article and try to give my perspective on why I think it's flawed. Let me know down in the comment section below if you do agree or disagree. I want to hear your thoughts. But thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like if you did enjoy this video or found any informative value, and make sure to follow my other social media accounts for updates on new videos. Links are always down in the description below. I'm most active on Twitter, giving opinions on news that I do not always get into video form, so do make sure to follow me over there. Also check out my Discord for all sorts of discussion on games. And again, thank you for joining. Consider subscribing for more videos like this. I'll see you later.